Well, it looks like we might need to extend our connect time. People are really engaged in connecting with one another, so that's really good to see. Video we just saw, man, what a good example of this young man who's being used by God to reach people in his surrounding circles. That's what we want to see, right? That we are not just living in our own little bubble and just doing our little comfortable little things and little stuff. See the word I'm repeating here, little, right? But that we're being used by God to just make an impact wherever we are, whether at school, work, in our neighborhood, wherever we are. Well, in the past few weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks or so, sitting in the church office here, and a few times where we have the little TELUS lady. We installed an alarm system last week, and whenever any one of the major doors open, the TELUS lady says, "Side door open," or "Front door open." Thank you, yeah. I practice all night. Or it'd be more like, "Side door open." So usually I'm not expecting anybody. If I am, then I know. But every now and then, a couple times I'd hear this, "Side door open." And I'm like, "Oh, who's here?" Because I didn't expect anybody, and we're not in a church where we have multiple staff or anything like that. So kind of go out and no one's there. And there was one time where I was there, I was speaking with someone in the office. Someone happened to be here and didn't hear it. And then it happened again. "Side door open." And I'm like, okay, someone's been. So I ran out and I go, I run out. And there's these kids who are like, they hear me scream, this like crazy Asian guy going, "Ah!" And they're like, "Ah!" And like, it ran away. And so we've been having these kids like this past week too. I hear this, "Side door open." And so we have these cameras that have this loop of recordings. So I walked outside and looked around, and there's no one there. I said, "I bet you it's one of the kids." So I go on the app and rewind a few minutes to see, and there's this kid who kind of just like casually walks up. Like, this kid is like, "I'm cool, I got this." Presses it, and then just doesn't even run away. The kid just presses the automatic door opener, "Side door open," and then just walks. And then a minute later, on the camera, you'll see me walk out. You're like, "Ooh, what's going on here?" So I'm not even mad. I think it's these kids. They've got nothing to do. They're bored. They want some attention maybe or whatever. So then I go back to my office and I pull up the videos on my laptop while I'm working on something on one half of the screen. On the other half, I have the camera. I was like, I'm going to watch to see if this kid comes again or another kid comes. I'm going to see that kid run up, and what I'm going to do, I made a plan in my mind. What I'm going to do is, before they get a chance to press that button to go, "Side door open," I'm going to run downstairs and go, "Ah!" and freak them out. Well, never had a chance to do that. I'm so disappointed because they never came back. But this week, this coming week, it's going to happen again. I'm kidding. I probably won't do that, but I will walk up and have a conversation with the kids. And my actual plan, this is my devious mindset, but the actual plan would be to have a conversation with the kids. Say, "Hey, kid, what's going on deep down inside that you're wanting to do this kind of sort of safe, mischievous behavior?" No, I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna do that. But have a conversation and invite them to our summer barbecues. We've already had kids who remember from last year that I've been here during the weekend. There were 2 kids climbing one of the trees in our parking lot. And I said, That's a liability hazard. So I asked him to come down. I said, can you climb some other tree that's not on our property? Because that's a liability hazard. We don't want to be responsible. And they were cool. They were cool about it. There's okay. And they said, are you having another barbecue? And I said, yeah, absolutely we are. You guys should come again. So this is pretty cool because they remember the bouncy castle. They remember the face painting. Good job, by the way. They remember all of that stuff. And so they're waiting this year that, hey, this church, Good News Church, is going to do something for the community here. So those of you who participated in that, helped out with that, okay, good work. We're going to do it again this summer. And we want to be known as a church that is accepting. So I won't be the crazy Asian guy who yells when I get ding. It's like the ding dong ditch thing, except this one is more of the handicap automatic door opener ditch. That doesn't have quite the same ring to it. But anyway, when something like that happens to you, right? Kind of come up with a plan. Kind of face an obstacle of some sort. It's kind of an obstacle because I'm working on something, and it's a distraction to me. And for those of you who have kids, maybe you know something a little bit about that when you're trying to get something done, and you have young ones who distract you, maybe. But it's a distraction, but you gotta come up with a plan. I'm not gonna let the kids continue to do this, because there might be one time where I hear, side door open, and I'm like, oh, it's the kids, but maybe it's someone else who comes in and steals a bunch of water bottles or something. I don't know, communion cups. They're like, oh, free food and drinks here. Let's just take it out. Take it for us. But we have some kind of obstacle. There needs to be a plan. And this is where we tie this into Esther. Week 4 of Esther chapter 4, where they face an obstacle, much bigger obstacle than some kids opening your door. They come up with a plan. Sometimes God calls us to wait. God calls us to not take action. And that takes discernment. Because usually God calls us to do something, maybe the more difficult thing. This is how I see it. Because for everyone, it's different. I was having a conversation this week with someone about Christians and black and white. We Christians, there's another pastor, and a lot of Christians, we want things to be black and white. Yes or no, right or wrong. And if you've lived life long enough, you realize that life is not so clear-cut like that. It's not all right or all wrong. Many times it depends, right? It's not all black, it's not white. There's a lot of gray. That's just how life is. But as Christians, many Christians, we want things to be simple. We want things to be right or wrong, black, white, yes, no. Many times it depends. And so it depends if being passive, if waiting is easier for you, if your personality is geared more towards waiting and not taking action, then probably God is calling you to take action because that's the more difficult thing for you to do. For instance, if you're in need of a job, and your natural tendency is to wait for someone to make an offer to you, God is probably calling you to go look for a job, and He's probably going to make you go through many hoops, not get the job on the first try, because He's working on you. If your natural tendency is to wait, if your natural tendency is that you're used to things just being given to you. He will probably cause you to go searching, and it'll probably be a little bit difficult, if not a lot difficult. But if your natural tendency, if you're like me, and you're more of a type A type of personality, and you're like, okay, something needs to get done, I'm going to go do it, and then probably, depends, God is calling you to wait upon him. Because your natural tendency is want to get things done. Something needs to be done, I'm going to go do it. These cough drops were supposed to help suppress your cough. I'm over the contagious stage, so don't worry. So it depends. It all depends on who you are. God doesn't treat everyone the exact same way. He doesn't treat all of his children the same way. He takes a look at his child and says, what is the need for this child, which is different from my other child, which is different from my other child, which is different from my other child, because we are all created differently and uniquely in God's image. We are all unique. Or else it'd be a boring world if we're all the same, right? But usually there's a plan that needs to take place. So we look at the problem that Mordecai got himself and his people into. And we see how God continues to work behind the scenes in this situation. So let's read Esther chapter 4. It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and waiting. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text and edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not drink or eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all Esther's instructions. Well, let's pray together as we get into this passage today. Lord, we thank you. Thank you for today. And we thank you for allowing all of us to gather together and to be able to connect with one another, be able to worship together. And as we listen to your word, we ask that you would illumine our hearts and our minds, help us to understand what is going on here. And even though you are not specifically named, what you are orchestrating in this scenario and how that may affect how we view our lives and how you're orchestrating the events in our lives. Pray in your name. Amen. Well, at the beginning of this chapter, Mordecai tears his clothes. He puts on sackcloth and ashes. He goes out into the city, and he's just wailing and weeping loudly and bitterly. Well, why? Why is he doing this? If you've been with us or if you know the story, well, what happened was Mordecai refused to bow or kneel down to Haman, the number 2 guy in this empire. Haman gets mad, he gets jealous, and he says, I'm not going to just get back at Mordecai, I'm going to get back at all of his people. This is kind of a racial genocide sort of thing that Haman starts. And so he gets the king's permission. The king's like, I don't care, go do whatever you want. And so an edict goes out with the official stamp of approval from the king, Xerxes, that every person who is Jewish would be annihilated and all of their possessions would be plundered. And so this edict goes throughout the entire empire. Every province, every city in every province. Mordecai hears about this. Every Jewish person hears about this. The citadel of Susa is shocked. Like, what is going on? This is crazy. Like a whole population being annihilated. And so Mordecai hears about this, and this was a traditional way of mourning. You tear your clothes, you put on sackcloth, you put on ashes, and that was a way for people to mourn. Esther doesn't know about this. She's sort of in her little royal bubble. And she finally hears about this. And so, in this passage, we have the problem, the obstacle, and the solution to the plot against the Jewish people. See the problem, the obstacle, and solution. The problem, the obstacle, and the solution to the plot against the Jewish people. We'll look at the problem first. Verse 8, Mordecai learned of all that had been done. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out to the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. The result of his actions were far worse than he could ever imagine. Far worse. He didn't realize, the way he's reacting, he didn't realize that this would happen. Now, last week we said we don't know why he didn't kneel. If we are charitable to him, then it was because he didn't want to commit idolatry. But if we were uncharitable, maybe he was jealous of Haman because Mordecai had saved the king's life before. And yet, who's this Haman guy being promoted? I should be promoted. I'm the one that saved the king's life. Maybe he was jealous. Maybe there's envy there. We don't know. Because the text doesn't say. We could speculate. But we do know that he probably did not expect this to be a reaction. That not only would he be killed, executed, but all of his people would be executed. And the reason that Haman gave was because the Jewish people are weird, basically. That's what he said. They're a peculiar people. They don't obey the laws of the land, but they have their own laws, their own set of laws. So they're not a part of us. Let's cut them off. So Esther hears about Mordecai, tries to help, gives him some proper clothes. Mordecai says, I don't need your clothes. So then she sends one of her eunuchs to find out about Mordecai. So Mordecai tells him everything, including the fact that Haman tried to buy off the king. He says in the previous chapters, 10,000 talents of silver that Haman said I would donate to the king's administration. This was essentially a bribe that Haman was about to get. Now, 10,000 talents of silver. How much is that? How much is that in today's value? Well, a talent of silver is currently worth around 22,000 US dollars, 22,250 US dollars. So in Canadian dollars, that's about 50,000 Canadian dollars. I'm just kidding. It's not, inflation is not that bad, the exchange rate. Maybe 30,000 Canadian dollars of some sort. Right? That's how that works, right? Yeah. So 10,000 talents is over 200 million, 300 million current, 300 million Canadian dollars. A conservative, that's a generous estimate. Conservative estimate, about 90 million US dollars, which will come out to what, 11, 12, 120, 130 million Canadian dollars, something like that. A lot of money, okay? Put it that way. It was going to be a donation to the king's administration, which they didn't need this money anyways. Tells us Haman was a filthy, filthy, filthy rich guy. And so Mordecai tells them all of this, tells the eunuch all of this to send to Esther, and then he eventually asks Esther, Esther, you need to go to the king and tell him to put a stop to this. This is the only way. This is the only way. Now, I'm going to ask you, when you encounter a problem, such as a tragedy like this, encounter this problem, what is your reaction? How do you respond? I think the way that Mordecai responds is normal. That he goes into mourning, and he does the typical things that constitutes mourning in ancient society. And for myself, when I encounter a tragedy or something like this, a crisis, extreme crisis like this, for myself, I tend to kind of shut off my emotions and go into problem-solving mode immediately. I say, I don't have time for this. Let's figure this out. Let's solve this problem. My feelings, I'll deal with it later. Let's solve this problem. Let's figure out what are the options we have and go with it. Right? I don't know if that's the healthiest necessarily, but eventually we're going to have to deal with our problems. We're going to have to deal with our emotions. It's okay to feel what we feel when we experience a tragedy. We've covered this in emotionally healthy spirituality. Right? But our emotions can be our friend and can be our enemy. Our emotions, if we're too controlled by them, are unhealthy for us. We become undisciplined people. But if we're not tapped into our emotions, that's when we live a false life and then all of a sudden blow up. You may know some people like that. You may be a person like that where, oh, everything's okay, it's all good, all okay, it's okay. One day, boom! I'm sick of this. I'm tired of life. I no longer identify as all good and okay and perfect. I am whatever. And then everyone else around you is like, where did this come from? But it's because you haven't been acknowledging your emotions this whole time, and you've just been stuffing them, right? When you encounter a tragedy, it is natural, it is normal to experience emotions like Mordecai. When there's a problem in your life, it's normal and natural to experience grief and to actually let your grief show. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. If you grew up in a context where your parents or other adults were like, shut up, stop crying, stop your whining, stop your complaining, don't show your emotion, right? Then you get in the habit of doing that. And as an adult, you then have to learn how to express your emotions. Well, that's the problem. The obstacle we see is this. Hathach reports this to Esther, and Esther says, well, there's a problem in verse 11. So all the king's officials and people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: they're to be put to death. unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Esther's life is on the line by approaching the king. According to the law, you cannot go to the king unless you're summoned. If you approach the king without being summoned, you're going to die, except if the king extends his gold scepter to you. And Esther says, by the way, king hasn't asked for me in about a month. And so I don't know when the next time he's going to summon me. It doesn't seem like it's going to be anytime soon. So this law was probably like, why is this law in place? It was probably because they wanted to dignify the king and maybe to prevent assassination. It would have been easy for someone to go into the king's presence if they wanted to assassinate him with a knife hidden or something like that, and all of a sudden just bum rush the king, stab him a bunch of times, assassinate him, and whatever happens to the perpetrator, whatever happens, happens. But he got his job done. Right? So this law was to kind of protect the king and also to dignify the king because, well, the more unavailable you are, it seems like the higher value you have. You know, if you are too available, then maybe it communicates low value. And so we don't have access to the highest people in the government, right? Kind of that same idea. So Hathach the eunuch sends this message to Mordecai. It says, we have a problem. I can't just willy-nilly go up to the king and talk to him, even though I'm the queen. I have no exception. I might end up being executed. Well, Mordecai says in verse 13, do not think you're in the king's house, that you're exempted from this rule. Verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and distress for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. These famous words here, right? Such a time as this. Verse 13, do not think literally means do not form in your soul. It's just deeper than mere thought. Do not form in your soul that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. He's calling back her attention to her heritage, bringing her back to reality and saying, just because you are in the king's palace doesn't mean you are no longer a Jewish person. Sorry, but I have more material. We're not at the closing yet, just letting you know. We have three observations from Mordecai's response. First, deliverance for Jews come another way. Right? He says, for if you remain silent at this time, in verse 14, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Mordecai had faith that they would be delivered somehow. There's no mention of God here. It's almost like the author of Esther deliberately omits God's name when it would have been so easy to mention God. But it's like the author sort of like deliberately doesn't mention his name. No mention of God. He says, deliverance for Jews will come another way, a different way. That's all he says. The second thing he says is, you and your father's family will perish. So the Jewish people will be delivered somehow, but your family will not. And then the third thing he says is, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this, for this moment. Who knows? And he doesn't say, this is the reason why you are here. Mordecai is not saying directly, this is why you came. But he's just putting it out there. Who knows? Who knows? I think this is important. This is like a little, very little detail here. We got to be careful about putting words in God's mouth, because sometimes we might have a conviction, or we might have some sort of desire or something like that, right? Some sort of inner kind of leading of some sort. And many of us might say, oh, God told me to do this. You hear this a lot, right? God said this, or God is leading me to go into this direction, or God is doing that. God is doing this. And we got to be careful about that, because God may not be doing that, and you're putting words in God's mouth. And the question is, how do you know? Right? The more honest way could be, maybe God is working in this way. Let's keep working to find out. I could be standing up here, I could be dishonest. I could put up some false narratives and say, God told me that this church is going to have a huge revival, and this place is going to be packed. I could stand up here and say that, and you guys might be like, well, the pastor said God, he heard from God directly, and we could create this hype, right? But I'm not going to do that, because I didn't hear a voice. The voice that I did hear is, you be faithful with what I've given you. That's the voice I've heard. Be faithful with what I've given you. And I'll do what I'll do. God will do what he does. And so Mordecai says, so the book of Esther actually, just before I say that statement, the book of Esther is realistic. It doesn't spiritualize things, but God is in the midst, even though God is not even named. We don't need to spiritualize things. Mordecai is honest. What Mordecai says is, who knows? But perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows? You became queen to address this problem. Well, Mordecai kind of created this problem, right? By not kneeling. But did he do it with conviction, or did he do it because of jealousy? Who knows? Maybe it doesn't matter. But Esther is risking her death either way. She's risking her death. If she goes up to the king, she might die. She doesn't say anything, she might die because she's Jewish. Either way, but maybe she's in this position for a greater purpose. Maybe. You heard the saying, everything happens for a reason, everything happens for a purpose. Again, we tend to kind of spiritualize things, but I'm just going to be honest with you and say, not everything happens for a reason. Some people, they'll stub their toe. Oh my gosh, okay, God, why did this happen to me? Okay, tell me why. Why did I stub my toe? Why am I facing this pain, God? There must be a grandiose purpose for this, God. Okay, you see how silly this is, right? Because it's just a stubbed toe. It happened because I was careless about where I was walking or whatnot. And sometimes things just happen, right? Maybe there's no greater purpose. Maybe there is. Doesn't matter. But there are some things that do happen for a greater purpose. You know, when I moved here, 2011, the original plan was to move here maybe 5 years earlier, 3, 4, 5 years earlier, to start the PhD program earlier at McMaster Divinity College. I really wanted it. It was in my heart, and I knew it. I wanted it. I saw the vision. But you know what? There was an obstacle. My dad had passed away not too long ago, and that affected my decision to leave the rest of my family. And I went through some periods of confusion, even a little bit of depression, because I wasn't able to fulfill my dream and all that kind of stuff. and I questioned God. I said, God, it's not like I'm trying to go to law school so I can be a rich lawyer or something like that. I'm getting a PhD in biblical studies. That's not you don't get a high-paying job with that. I'm not even trying to pursue that, God. What's going on? I heard nothing from God. Right? But I look back now, 2023. I look back now and I think, well, you know what? That was good that happened, because if I had come earlier, I wouldn't have met the people that I had met when I did come at the right time. I wouldn't have been probably a part of the churches that I were a part of, and more recently, I probably wouldn't have found this church and be connected here. And I thought, all of those things, that would have been sad. And so there's a purpose. So we have this crisis of Jewish genocide. We have this obstacle. And we have this potential solution for Esther. And so we have a plan now. We have a solution to the plan in verse 15 and 16. Esther sends a response to Mordecai. She says, good points. Verse 16, she says, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. That's the plan. That's the solution. This is not an elaborate scheme. It's not like Ocean's 11. We have all of these different intricate plans and stuff like that. This is probably the simplest solution or plan that we have. She says, gather everyone together. Importance of community. She doesn't say just pray on your own. Gather everyone together who are in Susa. Says fast for 3 days. Now this is probably more like 2 half days with a full day. So the rest of the day, that's the first day, second full day, and then the third day she was going to go up to the king. But she says fast. So maybe a 48-hour fast. Doesn't matter. Other thing is, there's no mention of God. She just says fast. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. Doesn't talk about prayer either. Esther is God's word, inspired word of God. It's like the author is deliberately omitting God, like not mentioning God, where we be so easy to mention God. Esther's saying, do not eat or drink for 3 days, and please pray for the petition of God, or something like that. But it doesn't. She says, we're going to do the same. Me and my posse, me and my group, we're going to do the same. And then when this time is over, 48 hours is over, I'm going to go up to the king, and whatever happens, happens. If I die, I die. Okay? Here's the plan. And so the plan is basically get together with everyone and let's fast. And by implication, probably pray. Not a crazy plan. And so we counter a problem and there's an obstacle. We come up with a solution. Solution doesn't have to be fancy. Our solutions doesn't have to be this crazy scheme. Sometimes it's just praying and fasting. But there is a plan. That is something that we can do. So Mordecai joins Esther. Yesterday was King Charles III's coronation ceremony. Anyone watch it at 5:30 in the morning? Or some highlights of it? See, I am becoming more and more Canadian. The American side of me is like, he's not my king. And then the Canadian side of me is like, well, he's not my king. Jesus is my king. This might be the final coronation ever. We'll see how the crown holds up over the next few years and decades. But theoretically, on paper, the king has the power to do whatever he wants. On paper. That's how much power a king has, a monarch has. Not only within the United Kingdom, but even the Commonwealth, who acknowledge King Charles as the king. Esther faces a situation where her life is on the line. So she comes up with a plan for herself and for her people to pray, to fast, and then to approach the king in hopes that he would extend the gold scepter to her. So we may face trials, we may face crises in our lives. We may face an obstacle. And our response to that shows us and proves our character. And so we learn from Mordecai, we learn from Esther. It's appropriate to mourn, it's appropriate to respond emotionally. But then after that, Mordecai makes a plan. Esther, you do this. Esther makes the same plan. All the while, in the background, God is working. God is doing his thing. We don't have to spiritualize anything. We don't have to do any of that. And so let's take a few moments right now to reflect if any of us are going through anything. Are we just passively sitting around and doing nothing? Or is there a plan as we trust the sovereignty of God?